And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, honoured by the 2025 Salter Awards. Good evening. Welcome to the programme. I don't know if you've had this feeling. Being away from work for 4 days, I was lucky enough, privileged enough to have that. It does take you a little while to get back into things, and that made me wonder about several things about the economic impact of the way that the calendar has fallen this year. So, while traditionally more people move around in a short period of time in southern Africa over the 4 days of Easter than at any other time of the year, even more, I understand, than over the Christmas period. And there are reasons for that. There's what happens every year at this time in Mariah, for example, in Limpopo. There are other reasons that people move around so quickly in the way that they do. And I was struck by a comment by the Transport Ministry, as if I understood it correctly, that in fact over the long weekend, there was not one fatality on the N1 into Limpopo from Gauteng. And you know how busy that road can be over any kind of long weekend, even just on a Sunday towards the afternoon, towards the early evening as people come back into Joburg after a weekend. It can be ferociously busy. And then you've got next week's public holidays. Monday and Thursday are both public holidays. That means that for various reasons, pretty much all schools in the country are off for the entire week, government schools and private schools, which then made me wonder if people are going to have more of a holiday next week than they did over the Easter period. All of this plays into a different thing. You have more and more events over public holidays over this period than you kind of used to. I mean, it's not just for some people schoolboy rugby, for some people religious events, for some people something else. But there's a conversation, I think, to have in South Africa about what I would call the public holiday economy. So accommodation, I'm talking about what happens at petrol stations on certain routes, how all of that is managed. And I did wonder if next week we might see a good example of what I would call an extended public holiday economy. Some people get employed just for those few days because there's a need for them, because there are more people who need to have petrol tanks filled, things like that. Of course, though, for employers, it can be quite frustrating because many people will take the entire week off, even though they're only really taking 2 or 3 days. I kind of know of which I speak. Just an interesting observation. I've been thinking a little bit about people in Cape Town, and they're actually in quite a complicated situation in some cases because property prices have risen. Normally, you would say that's a very good thing. But one of the things that's happened is that rates are going up relative to the value of your property. And there's quite a little bit of controversy in Cape Town, as I understand it, about this. It might mean that you live in quite a nice house with quite a nice value that you bought a long time ago, maybe while you were still working. Now you find yourself retired, you're on a fixed income, and the rates have gone up quite dramatically. So even though your income hasn't gone up, rates have, because the value of your home has, but you don't want to sell it because you want it for your children, you want to be able to sell it later in life, whatever the case is. I think there's a very interesting conversation there. We'll have that conversation a little later in the program. And then, of course, plenty to come, and we'll speak in a moment to Dr. Lumkile Mondi about the situation in the United States, what's happened with gold prices and on global markets today. All of that said, it does appear that the US markets are heading up today, maybe because of corporate news. Also in court today, the big arguments with the DA and the EFF on one side, think of that photograph for a moment, and the rest of the government sort of on the other. And yes, I realize the DA has not left the National Coalition. At issue, the VAT increase. And this argument has been going on for such a long time, since really the first attempt by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, to deliver his budget. And while there'll be a court proceeding, my great concern is that at some point there'll be an argument about some aspects of the constitutionality of the VAT Act. And while it might be tempting for various political parties to do that, when you do that, you're actually going to end up with a much more complicated problem, because you're going to end up with no certainty on anything for a long period of time. I think we're now at a point, if you're a business, the CEO of Clicks was very clear about this last week to us here on The Money Show, you do actually need to know what is going to happen with that. It's only next week, that VAT would go up by 50 basis points, 0.5% if you like, when in fact, we still don't know where we are, and that surely is a big indication of how broken our politics has become. I fear if you run a business, it is not going to get any easier. Good to hear from you this evening on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567, and of course voice notes tonight on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, another set of tumultuous events affecting global markets today. The gold price hitting $3,500 for the first time. The dollar hitting a 3-year low. That's one of the reasons the gold price was so high. JP Morgan saying today there is a 90% chance of the US going into a recession this year. Meanwhile, the IMF cutting its growth forecasts for the world and for us. And of course, much of this, I suppose, most of it is because of the US President Donald Trump, and particularly around his tariff policy, certainly that it was on again, off again. And then over the last few days, because on Thursday and again yesterday, he threatened to remove the chair of the US Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. Dr. Lumkile Mondi is a senior lecturer at the School of Economics and Business Science at Wits Business School. Lumkile, good evening. Good to talk to you again on The Money Show. I mean, this is all really, I suppose, what certainly looks like it's all because of the actions of President Donald Trump. Is this just about his trade policies and then his threats against Powell?
Good evening, Stephen, and your listeners. We call it the post-neoliberal economics policy, basically where there is a sort of a shift towards a center, but with a lot of confusion. By that, I mean, here is a President Trump in this case, who wants interest rate cuts so that consumers can have more in their pocket, which is something that we will associate with Keynesian or the left type of policy, and complaining that Mr. Too Late has not delivered to the pockets of Americans. At the same time, the very same president is cutting employment numbers in the Fed, and in doing so, taking away salaries and wages for many federal employees, and therefore constraining expenditure to those salaries. So we can see that mixture of policies and the confusion that it causes, and therefore it is not surprising that many of us have looked at the US and other big 7 economies as economies that brought certainty, that brought transparency, and therefore credibility. And now one of the biggest economies in the world has really lost credibility, and some people call it as an economy having signs of an emerging market like ours.
I mean, if he were to actually go ahead and remove Powell, whether his Supreme Court, excuse me for saying his, but in some ways it is, whether the US Supreme Court allowed him to, what would that signal about the US and its economy? It would be completely unprecedented.
Absolutely, but also it just shows to us about what the presidency and the political power that has been given to President Trump, and also the fact that, you know, despite all these policies that we've seen, whether it is the tariffs that is imposed in various countries and other things that we've said, and rising inflation as well, and declining jobs in the Fed, that despite that remains popular. Therefore, although it will be unprecedented, but more importantly, it seems to me that some Americans are quite tolerant, and they think that he's doing a great job given what they've seen in terms of some of the polls coming through from America, that his popularity is still a bit high, given what we're seeing, particularly the impact it's going to have on the American economy as goods and services become expensive, as jobs are being lost because of government action, but more importantly, with the difficulty of an economy that is isolating itself from the rest of the world, and therefore the expectation of recession by JP Morgan and many other economists in the world.
There was a time, I mean, a few years ago, I suppose 7-8 years ago, when people wondered about the independence of the South African Reserve Bank. Could the president then, I think you'll remember who he was, Lumkile, try and remove Lesetja Kganyago, for example? There was a very strange public protector's report that suggested things like that. It was struck down eventually. We knew then that the rand would be punished, that people would not trust South Africa as an economy, would not trust the South African government. The economy would have been very badly affected. if Trump goes ahead with Powell? Would it be the same consequence for the United States?
What we've seen in the gold price increased to just reaching 3,500 is a signal that if such actions have been taken, we'll see basically a flight to quality that we see in many cases in emerging markets, such as South Africa, where such actions like Mr. Kganyago being recalled or being removed from office will lead to rand depreciating and a flight to quality. In the US, similarly, that statement from his Truth magazine led to some movement. The people are very worried, and therefore gold became a safe haven. And we may see, if we had to do it, we may see quite a lot of selling of American securities by those that are holding it, and therefore medium and long-term rates becoming more and more expensive for Americans, and therefore a much more cause for concern because the recession will come faster than what was expected.
There's a funny thing about this. I mean, last week and then I think the week before, there was massive selling of US equities. That money comes out of US stock markets. It has to go somewhere. It can't all go into Europe. It can't all go into European stock markets. And not all of it is going to gold. I mean, is some of that money just going to be sitting in cash? I mean, could some of it, people have billions of dollars in other people's pensions they have to park somewhere?
Absolutely. I mean, you'll expect that, we'll be beneficiaries of that. I think there's more cash holding and a shift to other haven assets to try and manage all the perceived risk that is a result of this uncertainty. For South Africa, if we're talking more, we have resolved all our VAT issues than others. It will be a very good time for us to market ourselves as an opportunity for that money. But unfortunately, we remain divided. There is mixed policy signals, and therefore we're not as attractive as we could be, given the endowment that we have across many areas and the opportunities that South Africa provides for the rest of the continent, for many companies coming in here. So it is that opportunity cost that, despite a possible opportunity for South Africa in this uncertain environment, that we're missing the boat because even ourselves, our house is not in order, and therefore it may again pass us by and go elsewhere, particularly to the Middle East and other countries in the continent that provide opportunities such as Morocco, which is really running very, very fast and attracting more investment.
It's extraordinary. At the start of the year, the conversation was still about how exceptional the United States economy was. It seems set to continue to grow as it had. I mean, just outpaced everyone else for such a long time. Now it looks like the US economy might shrink and European economies might grow. I mean, hardly any of this was predictable just 4 months ago.
Absolutely, but even the European economies aren't going to grow as fast as you had expected them. Remember, Stephen, that already we know that most of Europe had industrialized and given China a lot of that capability, and hence we are huge beneficiaries in the south, particularly automotive and other white goods, given that China makes them better, much more cheaper. So Europe had already lost some momentum, particularly the Germans, the dependence on Russian gas, and therefore the German industry being dissipated. And recently, even the UK, with the government nationalizing the steel industry to try and salvage whatever it can to keep jobs and keep production capacity. So things are not as rosy in Europe, despite the American action, and hence the IMF has slowed down its expectation as far as global growth is concerned, because everything remains uncertain. We don't know how it's going to end in terms of tariffs. We don't know whether the wars are going to continue. So it's a very difficult global environment in the absence of leadership and the commitment to democratic values that the Second War Settlement had fathered. Now we're in a post-Second World War agreement, and it seems to me that Trump is trying to force us to think about the new settlement, and therefore that old political settlement that we saw after the defeat of Hitler is no longer there. It is that finding the new political settlement that is going to cause global growth to be slowed down in its absence, and therefore I'm hoping that there'll be new leadership emerging that will get everyone together again for this post-World War II, or at least post-World War II settlement, which is the third settlement, in fact, if you look at the two wars. And this one is a trade war. So it is that's required. I don't know whether Trump can do that. Will Starmer and Macron do that? I don't know. It remains to be seen. Maybe Africa, through the African Union, working with the European Union, we can do something and bring others to the table to foster a new political settlement that will lead to new institutions emerging, a new WTO, a different IMF World Bank confederation that gives more power to emerging markets, because we are the economies of the future, given that we've got a young population, we've got resources that haven't been tapped upon, and therefore opportunities remain in the African continent as well as Asia and Latin America.
Dr. Lumkile Mondi, really appreciate the time. Thank you. Senior Lecturer at the School of Economics and Business Science at Wits Business School.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Anthony Modasani is, of course, at Absa CIB. Anthony, good evening. $3,500 for gold. I mean, even last week before Easter, it hadn't got to $3,400. I didn't think $3,500 would happen so quickly.
Yeah, Stephen, so very interesting. I've got a nice stat for you. 2 years ago, it took gold 2 years to go from $2,000 to $2,100. 15 days to go from $2,900 to $3,000. 12 days to advance from $3,000 to $3,100. 11 to advance from $3,000 to $3,200. And then 3 days to go from $3,200 to $3,300. And a long weekend to get to $3,500 per ounce. So, I mean, that's how rapidly things have gone. And then, we've sort of retraced a little bit now. With the market sort of digesting and I think also Europe coming back in and that kind of stuff. But it just shows you how much fear and concern there still is out there in the market.
I mean, the volatility is unbelievable. And this is really the issue, isn't it? No one knows where to put their money.
100%. I mean, we had S&P down 2 and a bit percent yesterday. It's up 2 and a bit percent again today. So there's so much volatility in the market. And more so, what's been quite interesting is it's shifting more to US specific. So, the dollar's usually been a haven trade, US treasuries. And yesterday, you actually didn't see a lot of that. You saw the dollar under pressure. You saw US treasuries under pressure. And then the US market's lower. Today, a little bit of a reprieve, but it's almost focusing more on the US and the rest of the world's we're figuring ourselves out. Until Trump pulls himself in line, then, we'll trade you accordingly.
Wouldn't hold my breath. An announcement actually after 5 o'clock, after the markets closed, from Aspen. They're lowering their EBITDA guidance for the year.
So very interesting there, yeah. They said they're lowering their EBITDA guidance for its manufacturing unit by 2 billion rand, that's a significant number, right? And that's all due to some sort of contractual dispute that they seem to be having. The dispute is around manufacturing and technology agreement with the contract manufacturing customer for mRNA products. So they said there'll be a further impairment of about 770 odd million rand, which could arise in their full year 25 numbers, but they couldn't say further to that. So I expect that to sort of impact the stock pretty negatively tomorrow when we open.
And then Capitec, they've got numbers out tomorrow.
Yes.
And Capitec's been doing quite nicely through all of this.
And they've guided to tell us they're going to continue to do really well. They're guiding earnings to be higher, between 28 to 32% higher. Their non-interest revenue is also expected to come in quite nicely. So and if you look at the performance year to date, I think it's only down about 30 odd basis points or 50 odd basis points, even in all the volatility that we've had. So it's been quite defensive in quite a turbulent market. The other banks not so bad, but I mean, it is the preferred pick. It feels like by locals and internationals at this point.
Anthony Modasani, Senior Equity Sales Trader at Absa CIB. Really appreciate you coming in. Thanks very much indeed. Bringing the time on the Money Show to 6:30.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
Well, with the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in South Africa this week, I think most of the conversation is probably going to be about the conflict in his country that was started by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and whether or not our country, and particularly perhaps President Cyril Ramaphosa, can play any role in bringing about some sort of peaceful conclusion. But at the same time, there are important trade discussions to have as well. Wandile Sekhlobos, the author and agricultural economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber. Wandile, good evening. Good to have you on the Money Show as always. I mean, Ukraine, famously a very strong agricultural producer. People used to call it the breadbasket of Europe. It produces a huge amount of wheat. We see ourselves, I think correctly, as a very strong agricultural producer and an exporter as well. What kind of conversation should we be having with them?
Absolutely, Stephen. Both our countries are powerhouses when it comes to agriculture, but I still think that there is room for deepening agricultural trade, perhaps maybe more for the post-war world on that. Because when you look at Ukraine, Stephen, and the figures, they send out to the world plus $20 billion worth of agricultural products. And the composition of those products, likes of sunflower oil, maize, wheat, canola, soybeans, poultry products, and the likes. And I mean, as a country, equally, we send something around about just under $14 billion worth of agricultural products into the world. But what's different then about us, Stephen, is that we also spend just around $7 billion importing agricultural products. And in our import basket, it's a few significant products like wheat, palm oil, rice, poultry, and whiskey. And I think that in a wheat side, although we're not necessarily out there to encourage imports, we have farmers here that are boosting the domestic wheat production. But we remain with a gap almost half of what we consume, just around 1.8 million tons of wheat. And I think it is in that space where Ukraine, of course, quality and consistency and price permitting, they can look into saying, how do they boost their trade with South Africa in that area, even if it's after the war. And I think that's one of the areas in the sidelines of the conversations that will happen, we can perhaps from the agricultural side think about.
I mean, I suppose that one of the questions is, do we compete with each other, or are there ways we can complement each other? I mean, they probably, I'm sure, produce a lot more wheat than we do. We produce other things that they don't produce. We might be able to undercut them on price in some ways. Are there ways for us to complement each other, despite the fact we have both such strong agricultural sectors?
Absolutely. I mean, from one part, as much as they can send some wheat to South Africa, we also could look into their basket. Yes, they export over $20 billion worth of agricultural products, but they also import, Stephen. They spend just under $6 billion importing agricultural products. And when you look at what it is that they buy from the world in terms of food and agriculture, it's largely spirits, it's wine, it's citrus, it's coffee, tobacco, cheese, bananas, and the likes. And I think in two areas, which is the citrus and wine, perhaps over time, we can be able as South Africa to look at Ukraine to say, do they have the necessary buying power? Is the demand robust? Can we be able to export them? And I know that in the near term, these are very complicated because, of course, the supply chain issues related to this war. But when you are thinking about trade and thinking about firming these relationships, we are imagining them for the long term. And I think that in the long run, these are some of the products that perhaps maybe we could send to Ukraine, while at the same time they can look at us for wheat.
We also, Wandile, as you know, have a trade relationship with Russia. In fact, I think our international relations minister was there quite recently. I mean, we are a country that tends to have relations with everybody. That's sort of the point. Would we be able to trade with both of them? And I imagine Ukraine is not really in a position where it can say, if you trade with Russia, we won't trade with you. It'll be a bit more nuanced, a bit more complicated, a little bit more interesting, perhaps, than that.
I mean, Stephen, you recall, I mean, a few weeks or so ago, President Mbeki was speaking somewhere, and he made a comment where he was saying, look, generally South Africa is in a process of building friendships with many countries in the world. And I think President Ramaphosa has said a similar thing, and I think that's the tone even from Business South Africa, and certainly our side at AGBIS, where we say friendship and trade with everyone is something that we seek to achieve. And I don't see then our interaction commercially with Russia being a barrier on interacting with Ukraine or any other country. And in fact, we have seen Ukraine participating in the South African wheat market somewhere around about 2014, 2015, 2016. So it would really be them resuming that. But of course, on our side, rethinking about how we can send citrus and the other products. And we are assuming this something that could potentially happen after the war, when both countries are now in a reconstruction phase, perhaps more so on the Ukraine side.
The world trade situation is so complicated now, Wandile. I mean, some of the predictions that people are coming out with about the US economy, about the global economy, there were numbers from the IMF today cutting global growth dramatically. JP Morgan says that unless the Trump administration's trade policy changes, there's a 90% chance the US will be in a recession this year. I mean, that's unbelievable. Should we, in a situation like this, basically be trying to talk trade with as many people as we can, even if they happen to be fighting each other? I mean, would that be a sort of rational policy? We'll trade as much as we can with Ukraine. We'll trade as much as we can with Russia. We'll trade as much as we can with China. And yes, we'll trade as much as the US allows us to.
Absolutely. And in the midst of that, Stephen, we're not only just the merchants going out there. I think we try to bring peace, stability in the world. I mean, and these are important, Stephen, because at the end of the day, we are the chair of G20 this time. And I think that the tone coming out of South Africa about global stability is something that is important. And of course, then on a commercial level, we have to try to open up as many markets as we can, because the reality is that, and it's even more so when you think about agriculture, we have these industries that are export oriented. Yes, we face difficulties in the US, but we also don't have stronger penetration in China and the others, especially in agriculture. So deepening our agricultural penetration in China, in the Middle East, and indeed here in the Black Sea and the other regions is something that is on top of mind. And I would say, Stephen, if you were now this evening walk out of Joburg and you drive to Eastern Cape or Free State on a farmers meeting, the key thing that you will see different this time than the farmers meeting of about a few years ago is that trade will be on the top of the agenda. While last year, the issue of municipalities will be on the top of the agenda, rural security. But now, every farmers meeting that you go to, you'll see that trade is something that we are discussing in rural South Africa.
I know sometimes people look at what's happening around the world, and I often will say to people in these situations, you know, we've got difficulties with trade, difficulties with it seems more conflict in more places, and I'll often just make the point, you know, remember and be thankful that you live in a country that exports food. In other words, we produce more than enough for ourselves. That's quite an important thing to almost cling to in difficult times, isn't it, Wandile? The strength and, I don't always like this word, but I think I can use it here, the resilience of our agricultural sector.
That's something that we have to really appreciate about this moment, Stephen, because even when we are hit by droughts, or maybe when there are difficulties in the supply chains, we always know that at least in terms of the national supplies in South Africa, we remain solid. And of course, then we begin to worry only about what we can send to the world, because the reality is that we export roughly half of what we produce as a country. We have enough food at a national level. And of course, we do remain stuck with a household food insecurity crisis in South Africa. And that has a lot to do with the income poverty rather than the higher prices or availability of food. But the resilience of agriculture and the fact that at a national level we would remain secure is something that we pride ourselves with as a country while we work to resolve other challenges. And with that resilience of agriculture comes jobs, comes foreign earnings, everything else that I think overall it is a net positive for South Africa.
Wandile Seklobo, really appreciate the time. Thank you. Author and, of course, the agricultural economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber.
The Money Show, Stephen Grootes, is brought to you by Absa CIB, honored by the 2025 Salter Awards.
Well, a report in Business Live this morning talking about SAA, suggesting, in fact, according to a document they've seen, that SAA is looking at breaking itself into three separate parts. Part of this would be the airline part, actually would be managing their property portfolio. And if you think about where that property might be in certain strategic locations around the world, that might seriously be worth something, might require some top-notch sort of specialist management. Someone may be able to do something with that. Looks like Mango would go, and I mean, it's sort of kind of done, isn't it? It would seem. And then the other issue is to look for a strategic equity partner. We had thought that we would be able to speak to someone from SAA tonight. Unfortunately, not possible. We still are optimistic for later in the week, and I think that interview probably will happen. But just interesting on the strategic partner, because the obvious question is, would they have a controlling share, a majority stake? Would it be 51% or something less than control? If it's something less than control, would you put money into a deal with government? I thought that might be your answer. Or if you have majority control, is it still worth doing? There's another question to this, and if we speak to SAA during the week, and I hope that we will, I would put this to them. It does seem that SAA is making a profit. I mean, after everything that's happened, frankly, well done to everyone involved. If they're making a profit, maybe it would be better to sort of grow slowly, gradually, but organically than have a radical change. So just intrigued as to what about the proposed structure would actually get them to make more profit, to help them grow more quickly than they are now. And don't forget, there will be some competitors, you know who I'm talking about, who will be watching this very, very closely.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Well, a report in Fin24 today looking at the numbers involved in the decision by the City of Cape Town to increase the rates that you would pay on your property by around 8%. Because of the way some properties have increased in price so dramatically, add water and power increases to that, some people, it would seem, would be paying the council around 20% more. That's a big increase. Professor Francois Verrouli is Professor of Property Studies at the University of Cape Town. Francois, good evening. Good to talk to you. Really appreciate the time. I mean, it's such an interesting situation. As I understand it, some people might be in a position where the value of their home has increased quite dramatically. They have to pay higher rates, but their income hasn't gone up by nearly the same extent. They might actually be in quite a difficult position.
Stephen, good evening, and good evening to the listeners. Yeah, I think where I'd like to start with this is a bit of context, in the sense that Cape Town is growing fast. The population growth is above 3%. And if we just look at this, I mean, Cape Town has a population of about 4.7 million. 1.7 million live in informal settlements, and probably 70% of Cape Townians earn 22,000 rands and below, which means that they could earn a property of about 800,000 rands. So I think it's always important to look at that what we call the property market. And we are seeing the growth in that part of the property market that is not paying any rates and taxes. In other words, if you have a property below 450,000, there are no rates and taxes at all. So I think we're seeing a typical South African story playing itself out, where we have a city that is growing. Those who are arriving are not in a position to pay rates and taxes from an affordability, and their homes are too low. So I think what we're starting to see here is the city saying, well, okay, on average, rates and taxes are going up by 7.96%, about, as you said in the intro, around 8%. And then we're starting to see a sort of progressive tax system playing itself out here, where what is really happening is that if you're at 800,000 and below, you end up with an increase of about what is it? I've just got some numbers in front of me of about 6% if you have 750,000. If you own a property of 6 million, you will have an increase of about 23%. So the rates and taxes are not changing, but there are other fees. Where that increase is really coming from is from the water and sanitation, refuse collection. And what the city is saying is your refuse collection and your water sanitation, connection fees and so forth, that will now become a function of the value of your property, which wasn't the case before this year. So there is a restructuring taking place. I think it's a city that is realizing that the rates and taxes won't do it going forward. And so it's not the rates and taxes that are increasing, but the utility costs.
So in other words, Cape Town's not really doing anything that unusual. Most cities and most places will obviously ask for more from people with more expensive properties.
Yeah, so what happens, your rates and taxes are cents in the rand. Now, your property increases, the city doesn't benefit immediately because that only really alters the value. Happens every 4 years or something, where you have your new valuation roll. So yes, you can alter the cents in the rands, but that is not so much the issue. That's 8%. Even at 6, if you have a property of 6 million rands, you will get a rates increase of 7.96. that difference between 7.96 and the 22 is the other costs, your water, sanitation, electricity. So it sits more in the utilities, where a higher valued property will pay more for its utilities.
I mean, there's a lot of talk that sort of, this is a very complicated definition, but the middle class. So people used to living in Cape Town, some of the better suburbs in the City Bowl, are basically being priced out by what I suppose I would call European and Joburg money.
Yeah, well, I think it's happening on the property prices. So, some have argued as a city you shouldn't be increasing. You over time you'll pick it up in the property prices. But yes, you get to a point of affordability where your own success, and I think that's maybe one of the risks, that your own success starts making it difficult for a middle class to actually afford it, where you can have a property valued at a lot, and that happens in areas which are gentrifying quickly, where your property is worth a lot, but you can't afford the rates and taxes. And I think those, and of course, if you start seeing those rates and taxes increasing at numbers which are above the inflation rate, that's where it starts kicking in. But then again, as a property owner, maybe you'll pay more on your rates and taxes, but I was just looking at the numbers this afternoon. Property prices in Cape Town have on average gone up by 7.4%. So yes, a well-run city that has a budget and that can deliver, maybe you'll pick it up on the property values, which are increasing. So, Stephen, I suppose at the end of the day, yes, it is an increase, but I suppose the big issue sometimes one has to ask, what does one get for the money? You can also have towns where you pay your rates and taxes, but the service has much to be desired.
No, sure. Trust me, I live in one. Could we end up in a situation where Cape Town is a bit like what some people used to complain about parts of London, unless you were part of the sort of global rich? Cape Town's case won't be quite like that. But could you end up in a situation where actually there are very few people from South Africa living simply because they're priced out of the market? There's so much conversation around Airbnbs, for example, just, pricing homeowners out.
Well, the figures are starting to suggest that about 80% of the properties in the City Bowl are investment properties, and just about the same proportion on short-term rentals, So you have a property market that is playing itself out on short-term rentals, second investment properties, with those who are actually living in the city finding it difficult to afford. But Stephen, your point is completely, we saw that happening in London, where suddenly school teachers, nurses, and others just couldn't afford to live in London anymore. And that becomes the issue at the end of the day, that if you're sitting those in the gap market who are outside of the RDP market, who can get a bond, find themselves in a scenario where they just can't afford it. So, Stephen, I think the point is this, that on the one hand, properties are getting more expensive, but if you look at your overall cost of owning a home, which is the interest on your bond, but it's your rates and taxes, and you start putting all of that together, and that starts moving at higher than 30% of your income. Then affordability really starts playing its role.
Professor Francois Verrouille, thank you. Professor of Property Studies at the University of Cape Town.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, honoured by the 2025 Salter Awards. Good evening. Welcome to the second hour of the programme. I'm Stephen Grootes. We'll talk a little bit more about the Trump tariffs, and what is going to happen to our automotive industry. There are so many different layers to this. It doesn't seem automatic that the moment the sort of tariffs come into force, at 25% on our cars, by the way, into the US, that suddenly that trade just stops. And that's because if you're an American motor dealer, where are you going to get cars from? They haven't been made yet to take up the slack. And even just making them is going to be very, very difficult. So what's going to happen? I mean, there's still so much more sort of turmoil to come. And in some ways, I worry that we're just kind of at the beginning of that. We'll get an update on what's happening around our continent as well with Dr. Rutendo Ndwingi. And then don't forget, in personal finance this evening, John Manyike will be joining us. He's from Old Mutual, looking at how to survive the VAT increase. And I mean, the first thing surely is that the VAT increase, and it's so contested and political and now legal too, is that it's going to make everyone poorer. I mean, that surely is the first thing. It's going to make everyone poorer. And that is the problem that we're going to have at a time when really no one can afford that. And I think that's going to be one of the issues. I don't know if you've got any suggestions, thoughts, ideas, or just some frustrations. Feel free to vent them. 011 883 0702 021 446 0567 and voice notes this evening on 072 702 1702.
702. Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Well, while the US currently has an almost universal tariff of 10% on all goods entering that country, the 25% tariffs on vehicle imports to the US are still coming into force, and we might find that the full impact is really felt from around July or so. For the moment, our government has said, obviously, it opposes tariffs like this. You'll remember last week hearing from Jonas about his appointment as a trade envoy to the United States. Renai Mutilal is the CEO of the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers. Renai, good evening, and I do appreciate the time. Welcome to the Money Show. There's so many different ways to try and understand this, but from what you know, how big is the impact of all of this going to be on our automotive industry?
Yeah, evening, Stephen, to you and your listeners. My name is Renee. The impact across the autos manufacturing sector could be quite significant, both from a vehicle export perspective, but also the components that go into vehicles. And I was listening to your introduction, and I think you're absolutely spot on. Everything's so fluid at the moment, and particularly from a component manufacturing perspective in South Africa. I mean, the manufacture of components is really the economic rich part of the vehicle assembly value chain. And a significant number of components going into the US, typically on the back of AGOA, and a relationship that is part of a more holistic value proposition for South Africa as an autos producing destination. So, yeah, ideally we'd like to see some certainty in the outlook, not only in the short term, but longer term, and encourage responsible resolution where possible.
Renee, I'm sorry about that. I mean, the sort of example everyone reaches for is BMW X3s, because if you live in the United States and you want a BMW X3, you have to buy one that's made in South Africa. We're the only place that makes the left-hand drive version. If you want certain parts for that, it's going to be stamped made in RSA. You can't get them from anywhere else.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of the matter. In that, in the short term, the most obvious implication is additional price inflation on vehicles and components used to assemble, and also the backup service and aftermarket requirements. Immediately, short-term inflation is expected in the US. And interestingly, I mean, a component going into a vehicle, as you can imagine, safety-critical products, you can't just decide to invest tomorrow and next week start producing a component that gets onto a vehicle. That's typically between 12 and 18 months lead time. And the way this thing is playing out, who knows what the next 18 months holds in store.
I mean, is it too early to see if orders are dropping off? We know, I mean, wine's very different to you. The moment the tariffs were first announced, we know that wine orders were literally cancelled at a stroke. Wine's very price sensitive. Cars, not quite so much, and car parts perhaps even less so, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely. In the short term, we haven't across our membership base seen immediate cancellation of orders. And actually an interesting point in all of this, given that properly ventilated, is that the US is actually a significant importer of components into the South African market itself. Just out of interest, last year, South Africa exported somewhere around 4.5 billion rand worth of components into the US. 16 billion corresponding coming from the US into South Africa, typically used on the kind of vehicle platforms that you were talking about, and re-exported back into that country. So you can imagine the kind of disruption to not only South African production, but even the space. And I think as South African negotiation teams get to grips and engage with counterparts, the component sector is actually a good example. Here we've got a trade deficit with the US, and should be very clearly putting the markers out to say, well, there's where you're benefiting.
I mean, there's so many sort of headwinds gathering. I mean, the IMF saying today that global growth will be much slower, growth here will be much slower. JP Morgan saying there's a 90% chance of a recession in the United States this year if trade policies don't change. That will have an impact on the automotive sector generally. So, I mean, you're going to get sort of what inflation terms they call second round effects. You're going to get sort of, trouble from all different directions.
Yeah, I do think so, and especially in terms of some of the consumer impacts, it's not an ideal time for the sector. The sector has faced significant headwinds in a post-COVID environment, and this, to some extent, exacerbates things. We are sitting in a space where South Africa's got a very targeted industrial policy to support autos manufacturing and SA Autos Master Plan up until 2035. And what we're seeing is a combination of these various headwinds that are making it difficult to achieve some of those objectives. And we could probably be doing better than we are currently in some of the objectives. From a component manufacturing perspective, I think as these tariff situations play out, it's important, to find diversification in export markets. But equally, we need to be pushing even harder for greater procurement of locally produced components. Just out of interest, our own modeling says a 5% move upwards on localization of South African assembled vehicles could unlock probably about 25 billion worth of new production and new sourcing in the country. That's more than 5 times what could be lost to the US market.
Our government's sort of trying to respond to all of this. It already supports the car industry quite extensively. Should it extend that support even further?
Look, I mean, the call has already been made. The autos industry has been supported over a fairly long period, and it's got policy certainty at least up until 2035. The economic benefits that come out of having and hosting an automotive industry in South Africa are fairly significant. Employment, for new business opportunities. So the call has already been made. My own view is, yes, there should be additional measures of support because we are so far down the road in developing, growing an industry that if we don't find ways of additional protection, then you've lost all of the progress that has been made to date. And I mean, something that we should also be thinking about is, as much as we talk about the possible loss of export markets, something we should also be watching for and guard against is that our own domestic market ends up becoming, almost some sort of dumping ground for excess capacity of other autos producing destinations.
In some ways, I feel that's almost inevitable. Renee Mutilal, I really appreciate the time. Thank you very much indeed. CEO of the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers on The Money Show tonight.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702
1702.
Well, voice notes coming in this evening. Mark talking about property prices in Cape Town.
Hi, Stephen. Fascinating chat with the professor regarding cost of housing. I'd just like to make the point that I really think that residential properties need to be protected like any other industry in terms of Cape Townians being able to afford property in the land that they grew up. And I think any other industry has tariffs that protect local industry. And to me, it's absolutely astonishing that there's absolutely no protection whatsoever from foreign money in the UK, Germany, Europe, etc., buying up properties in Cape Town. So, yeah, just definitely something that I'm glad is being discussed and something that really needs to be looked at. Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye.
Mark, do appreciate that. Interesting thought. Rent control, things like that, all sorts of unintended consequences, but I certainly understand the sentiment.
702.
Stephen is on X.
At Stephen Grootes.
Time to hear from Dr. Rotendo Ndwingi, founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory, author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Find out what's happening in our continent. Rotendo, good evening. Good to see you. Our pharmaceutical market seems to be booming, and China is going to take advantage of it, and probably not just there.
Yeah, so good evening to you, Stephen, and a good evening to your listeners. Yeah, so this is quite another key inroad that China is making. China, obviously, not just from exporting from China, but importing to Africa, but actually from an industrialization perspective. Just to give you the size of the African market at the moment, it's currently standing about 25 billion, and the demand for generics and NCDs have gone up. And from a China perspective, the push factor that's causing them to actually start manufacturing and investing in other markets is around poor demand, limited exports, and environmental regulations in their own country. So having said that, by 2030, the pharmaceutical market in Africa is expected to grow by about 9% compound annual growth rate. So this is quite significant. So you've got players like Fosun Pharma, which is a Chinese entity that will produce anti-malaria drugs. And why this is so important, Stephen, is that 95% of the deaths that happen in Africa under the WHO Africa region are caused by malaria. So this is the upside for it. They're working with about 17 other Francophone countries. But ultimately, this can be a win-win for Africa if they maintain quality using the Lomé initiative, which is a standard for pharmaceuticals. So it can turn out to be a good story, but obviously if we drop our guard, then we'll get substandard stuff. So it could be a win-win for the continent.
Back to regulators we go.
Yep.
The situation in Gabon, I mean, quite a small country, rich for oil, important for oil. Is there going to be a big change? There's been a little bit of a political change there.
Rich for oil, 100% right, Stephen. Gabon depends on oil. 38% of its GDP is based on oil, 70% on oil exports. But what they're trying to diversify, and the reason for this is they've just got a new president, President Brice Gwema. He's taken over President Ali Bongo, whose family had been leading the country for over 50 years.
Aren't they related?
There could be. I don't know Gwema and Bongo, but definitely the 50-year legacy, that was definitely relationship. But Africa, you're my brother from another mother. Can be extended across the presidency. But 5 key initiatives that Gabon is doing, Stephen. Firstly, transition priorities, where they're saying let's focus on legal, water, and energy as priorities for the economy. Economic diversification, which just means let's try and move away from oil and focus on agriculture and mining, with a focus on iron under mining. Regional coordination, they're part of the economic community of Central African states, so they're trying to strengthen that under the AFCFTA. And the last 2 is youth employment, which is currently 30%. They want that to drop. And obviously a focus on political willpower. This has all been said by the presidential spokesperson. The question is, will they implement it? And they've got strong vision. There's a change of leadership from a legacy model. The question is, how effectual is it? And that's a wait-and-see game, Stephen.
GTEx Africa, they've been looking at sort of venture capital. They've been looking at startups. Obviously, it seems that the number of transactions involving African startups actually fell quite a lot. People talking about artificial intelligence and this, always a little wary of what it's really going to do.
I know your feeling. I also feel a bit artificial when I talk about this. But the reality is this, GTEx, it was a big conference. I've been to it in Middle East. It started some years ago, has a lot of success. They've done a branch off in Africa, and the last one was last week was in Marrakesh in Morocco. But one of the key points that came out was the investment with regards to AI, especially in order to stimulate the tech startup market. Unfortunately, in Africa, year on year, it's gone down by 22%, and this has been a growing trend. Possible reason, Stephen, is inflation, interest rates going up, supply chain disruptions, and geopolitics. But the upside is that even though the year-on-year investment has gone down, the increase of African investors in the space is actually going up. Over the last 10 years, they've moved from 19% of the investors to 31%. So that's quite a significant number. And it's also expected that their contribution will increase by 25% over the same period. So I think the positive sign in all of this is that although the numbers are going down, it's forcing a lot of the local companies seeking investment to look at organic opportunities with regards to growing their business, as opposed to just looking externally because of the lack of investment. AI plays quite a key role because it brings scalability, it brings efficiency. And I think the leading sectors that are attracting the investments from an African perspective is fintech, climate tech, and clean tech. And those are the key drivers. So it's an opportunity for change. One man's trial or disruption is another man's opportunity. So let's just see that how it pans out. But a key indicator for Africa to go in the right direction in terms of technology, Stephen.
And then UAE oil power being pushed in Uganda and Kenya. It's interesting to watch these countries pushing quite hard at the moment.
Yeah, UAE, every other time, when I'm looking at the trending highlights of business, you actually see the UAE companies playing a significant role. Another big opportunity that has come up is oil in Uganda and Kenya in terms of investments. Two big companies that come to mind from the UAE is Alpha MBA and Saudi Aramco. Alpha has invested about $4 billion in oil refinery in Uganda to produce, they're looking to produce about $60,000 per barrel, 60,000 barrels per day once the infrastructure is up and going. And they've jointly done an investment with the Ugandan government, which is a 60-40 split. So for me, that's a nice kind of investment because it talks to a win-win. Saudi Aramco has also invested in Kenya Petroleum, made a significant investment. The irony of this now is that it's causing Uganda and Kenya, who are your traditional neighbors, to be competitive with each other. And somebody was saying this was a negative thing, but in the bigger picture of quality control and competitiveness, I think it's a positive thing with regards to creating that competitive market on the landscape. But ultimately, some significant inroads by the Middle East, and they're also taking a gap left out by the USA, China, and Europe that are not investing significantly there because obviously of the green dollar investment and what's related around that. So great opportunity, and let's see how it rolls out, Stephen.
And then, Morocco, we don't really have a proper relationship with Morocco because of our strong disagreement over their colonial rule in Sahawi.
Yeah.
But they're looking for an operator for Africa's largest shipyard.
Yeah, so before that, the largest shipyard in Africa was actually Sandok Austral, which was in Durban. And that, in terms of size, Stephen, just to compare, was about 27 acres. That's a lot of shipyard space. The one that's been built in Morocco is 52 acres, so double the space.
Gee, that's a lot bigger.
That's a lot big. And the investment that has been put into that is about $300 million. But I think, and this is the thing when you're talking about intercontinental trade, diversification, leveraging off each other, their target market is specifically for Southern Europe in terms of, and if you think about it, where is Durban? Is on the southern tip of Africa, and Morocco is on the northern tip. So one would say, oh gosh, they're taking business away from us. But in actual fact, if you look at the dynamics and the geography of Africa, it actually makes sense to have a strong harbor at the top of Africa and to have a strong harbor at the bottom of Africa. But what they're looking for people to run and operate that business. So that tender is out. So there'll be a lot of people clamoring for that. I think the facility is 244 meters long and 40-meter wide dry dock. So it's quite expansive, and a vertical lift can carry up to 9,000 tons. So a lot of infrastructure resources have been put into it. The big thing for me, and why I'm excited about that it spreads out. Djibouti is also doing something big with the infrastructure. And on the West African side, there's a lot of stuff that's happening there. So it just spreads the load and allows Africa to be more susceptible to international trade from a dock perspective. So it's a great opportunity for the continent.
Dr. Rutendo Ndwengi, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Founding Director at Tribe Africa Advisory, author of the book Rumble in the Jungle Reloaded. Bringing the time on The Money Show to 7:30.
The Money Show. Personal finance.
Well, this evening, John Manyike is in instead of Warren Ingram. And John, of course, is Head of Financial Education at Old Mutual. And tonight we're talking about the impact on you of the increase in VAT. As you know, VAT, as things currently stand, next Thursday is due to go up by, depending on how you want to say these things, but technically 0.5 percentage points. So up 0.5%, but that's not entirely correct. It is 0.5 percentage points, or you could say 50 basis points if you preferred. But that is what is supposed to happen. As you know, the argument was in court today, the DA and the EFF on one side, the National Treasury on the other, and I think the National Assembly Speaker are part of that conversation as well, literally about whether or not the procedure that was adopted to increase VAT by this amount was done correctly. I suspect those legal arguments might in fact sort of outlive what happens politically. Well, John Manyike, it's good to talk to you again. Good evening, and thanks for coming on.
Good evening to you, Stephen. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. I mean, there's been so many conversations around this VAT increase. Everyone is going to feel poorer, and we keep coming back to the same thing. Weren't there any other options for government? And there must have been.
Look, I think it would take a lot, Steve, for anyone to make a case that the VAT hike was the only option. I think what is clear here that every effort was made to avoid your personal income tax. Yes, there was a clear intention to avoid, your fuel levy increases and so on. But I think on one hand, as much as one would appreciate that there are quite a number of serious economic issues to address, we know we are dealing with a debt to GDP ratio of around 75%. There are a couple of things government is trying to address, but I don't think one should just be pushing that without proper consultation with all the stakeholders to the extent that everyone is clear on why we need to go that way. But I also think maybe we may have missed an opportunity to look at other informal sectors, your gambling, which makes of trillions of rands. And of course, there's a controversial one of the taxi industry. So I just think that maybe we could have been a lot more creative in looking at other options. I know that the other political parties were pushing for maybe corporate taxes. On the other hand, we also don't want to trigger capital outflows because you don't want to discourage investors. I mean, we're not the only market where investors could put their money. There are other emerging markets that are competing with us. And also domestically, you don't want to discourage people from starting business. I think there's a lot to be considered, but I'm still not convinced that was the only option.
Well, I mean, the one thing no one wants to talk about is what expenditure could be cut. I notice that's been very quiet from the side of the government. And as many people would point out, there are plenty of things that you could cut if you wanted to.
No, absolutely. But I think we also need to consider, are we really prudent with the money that we have? For me, it's not about how much money you put in, but the money that you have, are you prudent in managing it? And I think that's an argument that one has been very consistent about. I think there's been talk of this fiscal consolidation, even from back in the days of the late Pravin, talking about this fiscal consolidation. Have we really followed through on that? Is there no duplication? I think there's still the elephant in the room around the state-owned enterprise. Yes, they were not given funding this time around, but I mean, do we need all of them? I think there's quite a number of questions to be answered.
We're talking to John Manyike this evening, the head of financial education at Old Mutual. The number for you to be a part of this conversation, 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. John, this is such an interesting question around whether this is about economics or politics. And I mean, I've suggested several times, I find it quite curious that the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, was almost politically disengaged. Did he really think a 2 percentage point increase in VAT was going to fly? I mean, clearly he did. But I do wonder, even now, especially in court when you've got members of the coalition government against each other, are we dealing more with politics or are we dealing more with economics? It looks to me like there's a lot of political noise, wind and smoke around.
Yeah, it does look like the political forces are outweighing the economic issues involved here. So yes, as I said earlier, we might be trying to deal with issues of how do we service the debt? How do we increase revenue and start paying off debt? How do we ensure that we address all the needs of the citizens? But on the other hand, I think it's quite clear that we knew when do we usually make a budget speech or table a plan, but I think consultation should have happened much earlier. And I think to get to a point where a budget vote is postponed, it's unheard of in the South African scene or political scene, so to speak. So clearly there are a lot of political forces that might be outweighing the economic issues. I mean, we know for a fact that the markets don't like uncertainty, and with all this back and forth, it's certainly unsettling the markets. I mean, and unfortunately, it happens at a time where there's also the threat of these tariffs in the mix. The last thing we need is to unsettle the markets further.
Yeah, I mean, I've got, there's so much more to say about that. All right, so the impact of that on consumers. I mean, my opening comment was that everyone's going to feel poorer, and I presume that holds true for companies, that holds true for suppliers, it holds true for businesses. It holds true whether you're rich or poor. You're going to feel just a little bit poorer if the VAT increase does, in fact, come into force next week.
No, absolutely. And I think maybe, some people just look at that figure and say, come on, man, it's just 0.5%. It's a very small amount. But I think the best way to look at it, you have to look at the cumulative effect of that 0.5, because your utility bill attracts a VAT. You have your short-term insurance. Already we've seen quite a number of service providers sending letters to their customers to say, well, there's a VAT increase as a result. Do expect your premiums to go up slightly by 0.5%. There's transport costs, there's education fees, there's your subscription TV, security services, etc. You name it. I think it will hit us differently depending on the type of goods and services we consume. But if you were to do your own exercise and look at what you spend your money on, barring the zero-rated basket, I think you will have a much more clearer figure on how this 0.5% will set you back. If it's anything to go by and it ends up transforming into 1%, well, there you have it.
I mean, and this is the other thing, is the on again, off again. I mean, it's so uncertain that at this stage, 10 days before, companies still don't know what's going to happen. They're expending time and money now implementing what's actually quite a difficult increase because it's 0.5% rather than a full percent one way or another. And all of that could be in vain if it's not there. What I'm trying to get to is the uncertainty is the thing. It's one of the problems of this.
Yeah, so I think what also we're not taking into account here with all this back and forth, there's a cost. It's costing business. Even communicating with customers, it also means changing systems. It's costing money. So this uncertainty is costing money. So if the court said by Tuesday next week, hopefully they'll give us a decision. If they say no, then it means everything else needs to be changed. We need to really just take into account that it's really costing big business a lot of money to comply, because there's cost of compliance. And I just think that right now the political parties are focused on winning this debate in court.
What can you do to protect yourself financially from this? I mean, if you're a consumer, we're all consumers. How do you protect yourself from this VAT increase? And I mean, we're in a kind of time, John, where I kind of feel that everybody needs to have a bigger savings pot than they used to.
No, absolutely. I think given all this uncertainty, we need to take that posture that says, well, if I had intentions to make big purchases, like maybe buying a car, you might want to pause for a month, 2 or 3, and actually gauge how the VAT would impact your finances. I mean, because surely you're going to be paying slightly more. It might be 0.5%, but cumulatively it might be a lot of money. So you need to rework your budget and prioritize your essentials. But of course, there's also an issue of thinking about an emergency fund. In an economy where there's a lot of uncertainty, you do need to have an emergency fund. I mean, if you recall what happened with COVID, a lot of people didn't have the emergency fund, and it was a crisis. And also, we may need to be smart. One thing for sure about South Africans, they're quite resilient. We've seen South Africans making use of these loyalty and rewards programs. That could be a new emergency fund. So don't take those for granted, but use debt prudently, because even there's VAT involved there. So, and also if you want to buy stuff, shop around. I think the days of being married to the same brands all the time, even if they are burning a hole in your pocket, are gone. So I think you need to do that. And of course, stay informed, be proactive, and do your best to be prudent when it comes to financial decision making.
So I mean, if you're running a business, do you think people are going to think quite carefully about pricing? I mean, some businesses might now absorb the increase and later kind of need to hit everybody with a slightly bigger increase. People might be tempting just because the 50 basis points is so messy, the 0.5% is so messy.
No, absolutely. Because I think, one thing that is certainly going to happen, there's no business that likes taking a knock on its profit margin. So, yes, maybe the first 2-3 months, they might want to, weigh the land and see how things are unfolding. But ultimately, the cost would be passed on to consumers, apart from VAT itself. Let's take an example. I'm going to make a very simple example. So say my business is to bake a cake, but I need certain ingredients to bake this cake. So I need sugar, I need eggs, I need flour. But every time I buy these ingredients, I'm going to incur my 0.5 there. Again, cumulatively, it will work out to a particular number. So now, if it's costing me more to produce this cake, and I still have to sell it, and I still have business expense. I need to pay employers, I need to pay rent. Of course, ultimately that will end up finding its way to the consumer, and that's the unfortunate part of it.
I mean, there's obviously, it's the way that things are happening at the moment. There seems to be no way around it. So when you do that, when you have to add everything, there are some products that are going to be VAT, they're going to be zero rated for VAT. And this basket of goods is supposed to have grown. Almost all of them are food items. That should make some difference for some people, I would like to hope.
Well, certainly, the zero rated for me is a magic wonder for me. I think it's best way to consider the less fortunate, even those who are not necessarily poor are benefiting from that. But it makes sense. I mean, things that we know this is basic. It's a basic need and it makes sense. But the reality is we're dealing with human beings here. Not everybody is sticking to the basket. There's other needs. There's wants in the mix. So unfortunately, people will spend money, whether or not it's strictly things in the zero-rated basket or not.
We're speaking to John Manyike this evening, Head of Financial Education at Old Mutual. How to survive the VAT increase, presuming it does still come in. And I suppose on balance, especially if you listen to the Finance Minister, it probably will next week. It's good to hear from you this evening as well. You might have questions for John Manyike on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Your questions on how to survive the VAT increase on The Money Show tonight.
The Money Show, Stephen Grootes, is brought to you by Absa CIB, honored by the 2025 Salter Awards.
The Money Show.
Personal finance.
John Manyike with you this evening, Head of Financial Education at Old Mutual. And of course, your questions for him on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. John, you made the point this is all happening at a very complicated time. And in particular, the trade war that we're seeing between the US and whoever they can find, but particularly, of course, China. It seems to me lots of different ways this can go. I mean, you would expect that prices will go up across the board, even for people in South Africa. For us, at the same time, though, China is going to be looking for markets to offload some of its goods.
Yeah, look, wherever there are threats, there are also opportunities there. And I think and that's a perspective we need to take, where we can't always look at the glass half empty, or it can also be half full. So I think that represents a lot of opportunities. It doesn't look like it's going away, because the more President Trump threatens more hikes, the more China also threatens to retaliate. So it doesn't look like any of them are backing down. But the question is, sometimes when the elephants are fighting, the bush is the one that gets most of the hiding there, so... but again, when you look at what South Africa exports to the US, yes, there's platinum involved there, motor vehicles, precious metal products. There's also citrus products. How this could affect us. Look, if it's going to cost us more to export, and there will be no point. We'll also have to find other markets. But the problem here is if our local industries are going to take a knock, then chances are we would also have to deal with job losses. And if there are other products that we're relying on, the likes of the US and so forth, are going to have a knock-on effect on us. The last thing we need is an inflation in South Africa because of course we know that's going to invite our Reserve Bank and Mr. Kganyago to start talking to us, and unfortunately we would not have a lot of nice things to say for those who've got mortgage. So inflation will be our biggest enemy. We don't want that. And let's just hope that the knock-on effects would not be that severe. But unfortunately, currently the relationship between SA and the US is not at its best. I'm not sure if we can still be able to save the AGOA arrangements that have been made over the years.
John, so on balance, in my view, and I can back this up if I need to, but obviously tariffs are bad for all of us, right? But there's going to be something else that comes with it, and something that we're living through now, which is this period of extreme volatility. So yes, tariffs are bad. But, so say, for example, you export oranges from South Africa to the United States, or you export wine, for an interesting example. The US is closed. You've got all of these oranges. You can't sell them in the usual markets. Other places are closed for various reasons. So now you have to sell them in South Africa. And that means that you would get probably better oranges at a lower price than you normally would in South Africa. So that's a good consequence. We were talking to someone from the car industry earlier. They were making the point, one of their concerns, I think it's a completely legitimate and rational concern, is that China has been making many cars. It needs to put them somewhere. It might send them to South Africa, for example. Although, to be fair, there have been tariffs on Chinese electric cars for quite some time in the US. So it may not be that big an impact. But just say, so on the one side, you've got some positives, cheaper oranges, cheaper Chinese cars in South Africa. On the other side, other things will become more expensive. How do you plan for that volatility?
I think it's a very good question, Stephen, and one that I would say that, whenever, we have to talk about inflation, you have to educate people that in that inflation number, if we talk about CPI, yes, that is the average, but it impacts us differently. So your CPI is not the same as mine, because I might be sending my kids to public schools. You might be sending yours to private school. You might have medical aid. I don't have medical aid. So inflation is going to impact us differently. So if I don't have a car, for example, and I use public transport, so the impact will be different. But the question is that, of course, for the poor as well as the middle income, again, the impact is going to be different. I think we're going to interesting times. As I said, wherever there's a threat, there's also an opportunity there.
Are you going to find that actually what's likely to happen is bargain hunting suddenly becomes a big thing, doesn't it? If you hear that someone's selling cheap oranges, you're going to stockpile those. You're going to do whatever you can with them. That's what happens next in these situations.
Yeah, and I think that's good for the consumer, to be honest. I've already had a couple of brands making statements to say they're really feeling the effect of their Chinese imported cars in SA in particular, because they bring this combination of technology that we most of us couldn't afford. Now, all of a sudden, voila, now we can afford this technology at a cheap price. And why should I go for that big German car, for example, if a Chinese car can give me all the features there? So I think it's good for the market. It encourages competition. And who knows, maybe that might be a saving grace for inflation for us on a couple of products.
Do you expect that actually that volatility might have long-term impacts and that we will actually start to buy in a different way? So you'll stockpile when you find things. If you don't find something, you'll live without it. People will buy different things. Tastes will change simply because the price of something has gone up in one way. If I recall correctly, in Zimbabwe, people did not eat as many potatoes as they do now because potatoes are relatively easy to grow. And suddenly you started to see more people just growing potatoes.
My quick answer to that, Stephen, is that, there's one thing that's common between politics and economics. Everything is a subject to. So in the short term, we might see some gains, but in the long term, a lot of things can still happen. So we don't know where this trade war would end up. Look, a lot can still happen within 3 to 6 months' time. So everything can change drastically. So yes, in the short term, we might gain. but you cannot be certain what's going to happen in the future.
John Manyike, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate the time. Head of Financial Education at Old Mutual. How to survive the VAT increase? You've got any other ideas? Would be very good to hear from you.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, honored by the 2025 Salter Awards.
Well, as I talk to you now, U.S. markets still heading up. Some strong corporate news out of the United States. The Dow Jones is up 1.8%. NASDAQ is up just over 2%. The S&P 500 up 1 and nearly 0.75%. There is a lot more to come, of course, on the Trump story and I suspect on the VAT story. And in fact, it might be quite some time before we really get an understanding of what is going to happen with VAT. That court case being heard today in the Western Cape High Court. And of course, more reporting for you from the Eyewitness News team around all of that. We will have more on Trump and tariffs and Powell, and the latest is a plan to completely radically downsize the U.S. State Department. That's the latest headline on that. We'll have that for you tomorrow as well. Also, speak to someone who has been a farmer and supplying some of the big supermarket chains you will shop at. Looking forward to that on tomorrow's Money Show.